Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artists Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the Artists Index podcast, brought to you by the website project. It's a collective community. Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the Artists Index podcast, brought to you by the Artist Index website project. It's a collective community digital archive. And speaking of archives, all of these shows are being archived in the New Bedford Whaling Museum's database in perpetuity. So that means your great-great-great-great-grandchildren can listen to this show in the future, which is sort of scary if you stop and think about it. We have our guest today, and as per usual, we'll let them introduce themselves to you. Our guest is brought to you by, in part by a grant from the Fairhaven Cultural Council, an agent of the Mass Cultural Council, and we're also sponsored by Heavenly Spirits, importers of fine French cognacs and armagnacs, and much, much more. So with that, guest.
So my name's Kyle DeCiccio-Carey, and I'll spell that for you, K-Y-L-E, and the last name is DeCiccio-C-A-R-E-Y. So, and of course, as I always like to point out, the hyphen is silent. That's my dad joke. So I am the director of the Millicent Library in Fairhaven. I've been here since October 2020. Before that, I was at Harvard University for a number of years. I studied history at Ohio State before transferring to UMass Dartmouth and finishing there. I have a graduate degree in Library and Information Science from Simmons University. I'm a certified archivist through the Academie of Certified Archivists. I'm also certified as a digital archive specialist from the Society of American Archivists. And I have certification in nonprofit management from the Harvard Extension School. I live in Mattapoisett with my wife, Jessica. Daughter, Alice, she's in her first year of college at UMass Dartmouth. My son, Archer's in the third grade. I also have 9 chickens, a corgi, and a cat named Freddie Purpury. And in my spare time, I'm the president of the board of directors of the Mattapoisett Museum. And today I'll be talking about Lemuel Eldred, who I sometimes will call Eldridge. I keep getting stuck on that. So that's where we are.
That's a good point. The pronunciation of, because even we were talking about accents, and pity you, a poor Buckeye. My wife is from Michigan, so you know what happened last week. And I'm not a sports fan at all, but I do pay attention to some things.
I am not either. So yeah.
But for example, when I was a kid, we had British bicycles, the 3-speed bicycles. They were like the rage, and we had the Raleighs. But from what I found out as I got older, that down south, they don't call them Raleighs, they call them Rallies. And that Raleigh is actually pronounced Rally. So again, that's all very, very important.
It is. Well, but I think Eldred is one of those, the spelling had changed. Yeah, it may be the same family. I do think that, when I was reading about Lemuel, that I would see in some records or sources him being called Eldridge rather than Eldred.
Mm-hmm. Tell us more about him, and we are going to be doing a couple of more podcasts regarding Fairhaven-based historical artists, and historical is a euphemism for dead artists. What prompted you to start off this series with him?
Well, it was difficult. We have a lot of I'm amazed at the artists that are not just from Fairhaven, but from around the area that are pretty well known. Maybe I shouldn't be amazed, but I wanted to kind of focus on artists that maybe not a whole lot's known about. And Eldred was one of those, which really kind of surprised me. So it was fun for me because I love to do historic research. So Eldred, there wasn't, just what I was finding out there, if there's anything published, it was like little snippets, and it wasn't always accurate from what I found. So, for example, he was born in Fairhaven in March 1850. He had two brothers, Albert and William. Albert evidently was a well-known house painter in town, and William was a carpenter. But a lot of the sources would talk about Eldred and how he, decided to become an artist and what his inspiration, and they'll say it was his father. His father was a shipbuilder, and so Eldred would hang out with Dad. He would go to Dad to the shipyards while he would build ships, and he took a sketchbook and he would just sketch things that he saw, or he would go fishing with Dad. And so there's a big influence from the man of the house, and this young boy who became a well-known artist. And so Eldred was born in 1850. His father died in November 1853. So I'm thinking, this stuff is made up, or this is one hell of a 3-year-old.
Yeah, genealogy can get to be a little rough. If people aren't using primary source documentation, as you know.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of this stuff was, obviously I've got a bit of an advantage here because many of these things were written long before ancestry and
right.
on digitization of records, and so it was easier to find. So Eldred actually talks about his mother as being, he grew up around the arts. His mother was loved the arts. She practiced. I'm trying to think of what she used to do. What he called the womanly arts, the crafting, the sewing and things like that.
Needlepoint, that embroidery, that kind of thing.
Right. But he said that he was really influenced by his mother's love of the arts.
Aquarelle was another thing too, or watercolor was considered for some reason a feminine.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, even like crafts, when you think of like crafts, it's like, well, it's art. It's skilled and it's creative. And but Eldred talks about what kind of became his inspiration to trying art was he credits Caleb Purington, which was Purington, along with Benjamin Russell, created the grand panorama of a whaling voyage around the world in 1848, which was at the Kilbourne Mills. I don't know if you had a chance to go see it, but that thing was amazing.
Yeah.
And if you didn't get a chance to see it, the Whaling Museum has a great story map online exhibit of it. That's, you can zoom in and see the details. And but Caleb Purington was, he was from Fairhaven too, lived in town. So he was watching, and it sounds like Purington was more of maybe a commercial artist. So he saw Purington paint polar bears on the side of an omnibus, and he kind of memorized that, and then went home and got a piece of board and sketched it at home from memory, which I think's funny, because it was like, how did this wonderful artist become, like, what inspired him? It was like, it was bears on the side of a bus.
Yeah, you never know, right?
Right. Yeah. So he was friends with Purington, but it wasn't the mural that inspired him. It was the polar bears. So he evidently I don't know whatever happened to that art. He probably tossed it or whatever, but it's that got him going. So he was friends with Purington, and Eldred. Evidently he started sketching and things like that, and was very interested in creating art, and he may have even worked with Purington But Purinton was no professional artist, at least outside of polar bears or whatever it is else that he used to do in the panorama. But I don't think he was ever that was his main thing. But he, I forget where I was going with this. There was somebody else that he started to study under. Oh yeah, it was a guy named William Mosher, and Mosher was a portrait artist. And
now here's one of those points of fact: Mosher or Mosher?
I don't know. I thought of that. Is it Mosher? I say Mosher. You say
Mosher. Around here, it's Mosher.
Mosher or Mosher?
Mosher, yeah.
Mosher,
yeah, Mosher,
right.
yeah.
William Mosher.
Mosher. Yeah.
Okay, so but I couldn't find much about this guy, which I thought, I went down this rabbit hole. Like, well, who is this guy? Where did he come? Like, where did he go? Like, he was born maybe in 1830, 1833, depending on the source. He was in the 1860 census as a painter, but I couldn't find anything else.
Did Mary Jean Blakesdale, who wrote this now seminal Directory of New Bedford Artists, is he one of the listings in there?
I don't know if I looked at that. I can look, but yeah, I just thought there might be more like the Fairhaven Star and things like that. There might be things in it, but unless he had a different spelling of the name. Like, I didn't dig too deep into it, but it was like, oh, I'm kind of, this is one of his influences, but there doesn't seem to be of course there wasn't a lot.
Just based on that, I mean, for lack of a better term, this Fairhaven seemed like a hotbed for artists. I mean, William Bradford, Lemuel Eldred, come on, who else? There was a bunch of them here, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's and there were, yeah. I don't know what to say about it. I mean, it was, and that's why I'm like, oh, this is amazing. Like, we have all this art and these talented people, and we still do. I mean, it's not anything new, but so yeah. So what he did with Mosher is he taught him to do portraits from like enlarged photographs. So he did that for a little bit. He created a few, but in the meantime, with his friendship with Purinton introduced him to William Bradford, which Eldred says that was had the most profound effect on his life and in his career as an artist. So Bradford, of course, he was born in Fairhaven in 1823. He did seascapes, Arctic seascapes. He's considered part of the Hudson River School. Eldred had a studio in Fairhaven and in New York. So it sounds, well, I don't know if this is by chance. So where I'm getting a lot of my information is there's a book called Eldred in Print, Recollections of a Fairhaven Artist. And we had I don't know if you heard of Almanac, if I'm saying that right. So he was recently, he was involved with the community here in Fairhaven for a number of years, and he did a lot for the arts and in collecting arts. He was the art curator for the town. And he did a lot of his research on Eldred and actually got a couple of works of Eldred, which are now hanging at the town hall. And he put together, Eldred had in the maybe between like 1907 and 1912 or 15 or so, wrote articles for the new bit. I think it was the Standard Times, where he talked a lot about the history of Fairhaven. Eldred seemed very living in the past, or at least he was a nostalgic guy. The histories he wrote were very descriptive, and it almost sounds like that he was there. I mean, he was there for some of it. He talked about, when we were a kid, we used to play behind this building that's sadly no longer there, But then he would even talk further back from stories that he had heard. But he also wrote as not long before he died in the late teens about his time as an artist and his travels and things like that. So, and he had written about meeting Bradford. So apparently he ran into Purington on the street one day, and Purington's like, "Hey, you want to go over and meet William Bradford and later this afternoon?" And of course, Eldred knew who Bradford was. He's like, "Yeah, I want to meet him." So they agreed. Like, well, at this time, let's meet here. And Eldred said, he said when he went to go meet him, that he's like, that's the most punctual time he's ever been for anything. He wanted to make sure that he was there, and he met him, and so they got together and they went over to Bradford's studio, which I believe was, I looked this up at one point. I'll think about it. I'll think of where it was, but they met and they went over, and they went in, and Bradford was there. He was working on something, and Purington introduced them. And according to Eldred, it was just like, it's like, "Hey, how you doing?" And Bradford just went back to work. And so Purington left and just left them there. And it was quiet. Bradford's working, not talking to him, not, as if Eldred just wasn't there. And then after a while, Bradford stopped and he turned to Eldred and he asked him, "Eldred, have you ever painted before?" And he said, yeah, he'd done some nature paintings. And Bradford said, "Well, why don't you bring them to me? I want to see them." And he just went right back to work. Didn't say anything. So Eldred's just kind of standing there, and he's like, "Well, I'll just go get them." So he left, and as Eldred put it, that he left in a much excited mental state, which I think is a great way to say that you're excited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He went home and got the paintings, and he went right back to Bradford's. So he went in there, and Bradford was still working, and he stopped after a little while, and he started to look through them, and he went through each one. He took over like 6 or so, and just he studied these things for a while, each one at a time. And then he kind of paused for a little bit, and he looked at Eldred, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that if Eldred goes through life as conscientious as he has with his works, then he thought he'd do pretty well for himself. And then he asked Eldred, he's like, "Would you have good light to work with at home?" I don't think he did, because Bradford thought, and he's like, "Well, do you want to come hang out here and paint? I got an extra easel." He just met him, and he's like,
yeah.
And Bradford was really well known at that time. So, and that's what he did. Eldred would hang out with Bradford, and they would quietly paint together. And of course, I'm sure Eldred observed him and was picking stuff up. And so when it got closer to during the winter, Bradford would go back to his New York studio and stay. And he asked Eldred if he wanted to go for the winter. Like, "You want to come? You can continue to work in my." And he's like, "Yeah, sure." So at this point in Eldred's life, he never traveled. Like, he'd never been out of the Fairhaven area, maybe New Bedford, but I mean, he never had gone far. So it was his first time in going to New York, and and it's much like what you'd expect. It's like, he's overwhelmed. He's amazed at the vastness of the city. He had no idea where he was on the ride over to Bradford's, and they dropped him off, and he felt alone in this big city. And so apparently Bradford had a policeman nearby, came over and got Eldred, and they took him to Bradford's house. And so that was kind of his first meeting with Bradford, which I think is just, in my mind, it's like they didn't talk, they just painted. Like that's just what but I'm sure there was discussions and stuff.
He was almost like the archetypical hayseed. That was a term that they used to use about people that fell off the hay wagon, as they would say.
Yeah.
Bright-eyed, had no idea easy
Right.
mark for the shysters in New York.
Right. Yeah. And maybe that's why he had the cop go over and say, "Hey." So at some point, I don't, Bradford, or he either stayed there for a while. I think he ended up staying with Bradford in New York for about 5 years or so, just working with him, studying with him. And while he was in New York, he eventually entered the National Academy of Design, which isn't, you have to be nominated to go there. And so he was doing pretty well with his art in New York. And of course, Bradford introduced him to all kinds of people, or just happened to meet, because Bradford knew people. He met Wilkie Collins, who was an English novelist. I think he's credited as being like the first British detective story writer, or he wrote a novel. He met Edwin Booth, who was an actor, which also his older brother was John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Lincoln. He told of a story about he had accompanied Bradford to a steamship. Bradford was heading to England, and they stepped onto the deck, and there's General Grant. He says, Ulysses S. Grant, who was also the 18th president of the United States. Grant came over, shook his hand. They would start talking, and he was just amazed.
He was Forrest Gump.
He was, and that's how I picture him, which is funny, because it doesn't, like, I often wonder if that inspired Eldred to just want to go out and see the world. Like he I think it would any of us. We were just like thrown out here, and you're meeting all these interesting people. He talked about meeting well-known scholars and clergy at the time, just all kind, other artists that he had known about. He hung out in New York at the 10th Street Studios in New York, which he refers to as the Arc, or the Old Arc, which was an art studio where people like the artist that created the Washington crossing the Delaware had.
Starts with a D.
No, is it Emmanuel Lutz?
It's Lutz. Yeah, I'm thinking of D for Delaware.
Oh, okay.
It was Emmanuel Lutz. Yeah. The big story there. Then let me stop you for a second on a couple of things. Number one, the relationship between Eldred and Bradford. There's stuff for a book there.
Oh yeah.
I mean, a book
definitely.
of a movie, a documentary, whatever. And then the other thing is that someone had asked me this question about another culture, about the Portuguese culture, but around the same time, around the turn of the century, just before World War I, or the Great War, or the war to end all wars, which was a total farce. But whatever happened to this American intellectual scene? I mean, it was visual, performing, literary. I mean, it was phenomenal. And it just seemed like it got so pedestrian or trite, or
I don't know. I mean, does it still exist? It's just we're not. Is this more something that happens out, in Hollywood, or the acting community, where you're going to have more? Did it just shift to the West Coast? I guess is what
I'm talking intellectual.
Well,
I mean,
okay.
I mean, there was
point,
just the Harlem Renaissance, which bloomed, was there before anybody knew it was there. But this whole East Coast intellectual thing, where, it was quite the scene back then. And all of these people knew each other. When you consider, well, there was a high probability that a lot of them knew of each other, or knew each other. When you consider the differences in communication, it's just absolutely amazing. Their social network was greater than, for lack of a better term, at a base level. Their social network was highly functional, by letter, by visitation, by whatever. And wow. I mean, it's also too, the connection from little old Fairhaven and New Bedford to New York, this seems that connection seems obvious, but also there's more than one connection. There was the same connection with Beardstock. There was the same connection with Ryder. It's amazing the ebb and flow between New Bedford and New York.
Mm-hmm. Well, did any of that? I'm just guessing. I mean, did any of that have to do with New Bedford being a major port in New York, and there were influences there when people would come in, they're bringing things with them and ideas with them, and one of the things that I used to, I mean, I've done it a while, but I'm not a sports guy, but since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by baseball history. And when I moved out here, I was like, oh, I want to start researching baseball history. And I found that baseball was being played in New Bedford in 1858, when it was, at the time, you did have a little bit in Massachusetts, but New York, it was it had been going on since like at least the 1830s in New York. And it's like, well, how did this game make it here? And it's well, that's what I came to the conclusion is like, you just had this major, we had this whaling port, and sailors would come in and different people would come in and bring this. Plus it's bat and ball games have been played. And but what was being played in New Bedford, which wasn't being played in areas like Boston, was what they called the New York game. There were like two competing games. One was the Massachusetts game. It was very much it was different, but it was the same concept as it was baseball, just with differences to it. And but then why was it being played in New Bedford of all? Why was the New York version being played in New Bedford? And it was called that at the time. And that's I think it had a lot to do with that. You just had outsiders coming in all the time, bringing things in with them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I don't have any New Bedford references, but I do remember a gentleman named Gunnar McGonigal, who was a stonemason, a bricklayer, who, and it's arguable, and I'm not a sports guy either, I'm more interested in history, who's credited in the creation of the catcher's mitt. Okay. He was a catcher, and then he was getting stung like crazy, and he's like, this is insane. I mean, what do the bricklayers used to toss bricks in the air, from the ground up to the guy laying it on the staging, and they had a glove to catch the bricks, which oddly looked like a first baseman's glove. Right. And he modified that so that he wouldn't get stung in the hand. So, I mean, that's just like one of those little anecdotes, but there's just so many of these wonderful stories that, need to really be perpetuated, because sometimes it comes down to the anecdote is the only thing that you've got, is the only foothold to history that you have.
Right.
That's almost quotable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, now, Eldred's claim to fame was more of a printmaker than a painter, perhaps?
No, well, it's hard to tell. I think, yeah, he did do a lot of prints, but it sounds to me that it was painting. It was, he exhibited at different places, and there were paintings, and he had a auction, Ellis's, I think it was called Ellis's
auction house,
auction house or gallery in New Bedford, and they advertised 50 of his paintings, oil paintings, going up for auction in 1880. So I think with him, it's just his works are just scattered all about. So it's hard. There's no like comprehensive list, of a lot of his works or when they were created and things like that. So, but yeah, there are a lot of etchings and prints of, like, we have an etching. It's a print of an etching. It's it's not the only work that we have here. What we have here also is we have one of his sketchbooks. I don't know when, we got it sometime in maybe the 1960s or 70s. It was given to the library. And it's mostly sketches of rowboats or small sailboats.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting. It's I was going through it to try to like find other art, because there are some like larger, some seascapes and things like that in it, like just really rough sketchings, and just to see if I can find any other works of art that maybe like this was the start of this, or this was his idea before he moved on. But I haven't found anything. But it looks like a lot. No, like in a lot of them too. Like he wrote a lot about history and his in a lot of them were like like beat up rowboats that have been abandoned. That's what they. It was the impression that I got from looking at these.
And I don't know of the exact timeline, but Beetle Cat, which became a really famous style of sailboats, small sailboat. I'm wondering if he captured anything, in his sketchbooks. And before I forget, I saw it. I know it's somewhere nearby, which could be within an hour's drive from here. But somebody's having a show of Eldred.
That is correct. That is actually at the New Bedford Art Museum.
Okay. Wow, closer than I thought.
Yeah, December. It starts in December and runs through February, I believe. Yeah, I wrote that down too somewhere here. But yeah, definitely. Yeah, I wanted to at some point that out. But yeah, and I'm excited because I want to go over there and see that. But there's also works of Eldred, I believe, at the New Bedford Public Library. And there are museums. I think the Met may have, like, they have them digitized. You can see them online. Mm-hmm. It's always better to see them in person, obviously. But if you can't, get there to see them. But yeah, I'm excited to see the New Bedford Art Museum.
Was there any blow away moment that you had when you were researching him for this podcast?
I think everything.
Several of them.
I mean, yeah, that's just it. Just how he got from there. Like, his father died. He was 3. His mother never remarried. And at the time, it's like, I don't know what she did for work. I don't know how the family was supported. I know I think he graduated from Fairhaven High in 1868. So it wasn't like he dropped out of school and went to work. I don't know about his brothers. So yeah, just that whole social way of dynamic back then about the father being the breadwinner and because oftentimes the mom would remarry because she needed there was just these things like if the man lost if the spouse died, he would definitely remarry because the guy's not gonna raise the kids on his own and work. But we still have that today. Women are going to work, but they're still
but back then and I know at least until the 30s because of personal family history, but back then it was finances and family, or raising family. My grandmother passed when my father was 3 of tuberculosis, and my grandfather was desperate to remarry because he had 3 boys,
right?
And there was no childcare back then, and this was the already the dissolution of the nuclear family that hadn't even been coined, because most of the family was up from Quebec, up north, 14 hours from here. So as far as a social or familial network down here, it didn't exist. And, he had to marry to have someone, tending the hearth fires. And I know by today's standards, it sounds like abhorrent to feminists and so on and so forth. But on the flip side, if a woman lost a husband, what she lost, other than a companion, was a source of income,
right,
and could face a destitute future. So it is a wonder, how did Mrs. Eldred get on?
Right. Yeah, there may have been other family there. I know that they were, his parents were from the Cape, and so at some point they moved up to Fairhaven, but I don't know when that was. But I don't know, maybe other family came up too. I didn't get that deep into their genealogy, but there is that. There is, when you had, but it's like still, she had to. I don't think, did they own the house? Did they pay the rent? Did they just did dad build that? It's like, I have no idea, but that's what I find. Even today, it's difficult for single parents to do what they need to do to pay the bills and raise the kids, but yeah, I think, and then he was able, he didn't go, as far as I can tell, he didn't have any education beyond high school, other than no formal education through university, college, whatever, but obviously through other artists. But he was privileged in that way, because they would take him in. They weren't, they were like, oh yeah, this kid, he's not bad. I'll help him out. So in doing this, and then I wonder, because I start to think about this whole economic issues going on here, and how bills are paid, and how he rose up, but how many Black artists did we have from Fairhaven or New Bedford from the 19th century? Like how many of them went on to study with? I really don't know. I'm assuming,
and that's
we don't know.
a whole other issue in and of itself, because there may be, is it Mitchell, Michael Edward Mitchell Bannister, I think it is, a Black landscapist. In fact, one of his pieces is hanging in the Reframing Landscape show, currently showing at the New Bedford Whaling Museum.
Okay.
And as I was working the wall from the right around, I saw this one piece that just snapped my head back. I was like, oh my goodness, I feel like I'm there. It was a plein air, a la prima plein air. And I looked and I read, and not only was he an African-American artist, but he was a co-founder of the Providence Art Club, and he was also a co-founder of RISD, Rhode Island School of Design.
Okay.
And there had to be others. I know that we had a bunch of Black photographers, but unfortunately, between race and class, a lot of these people just fell through the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have the support systems of the of polite society.
Right.
Yeah.
And I feel like with Eldred, it was the class. He was, the family was poorer. It's, so he was, in the fact that he was able then to get there, but the, race too, and sex, like how many women, there's one, we have some of her works here, Lillian Dexter, who I want to know more about her. We have something of hers on display. Evidently she was a commercial artist, but she did things on the side. I think she died in the 1920s, but we don't have any information. We don't have much on her, so I don't.
And there's another lady, Cape Verdean extraction. Her daughter's name is Heidi Lewis, and what is Vivian's last name? She was involved with the Fairhaven Cultural Council for years, and she also helped set up the hometown home days, whatever it's called.
Right.
I'm not a Fairhaven native, so I'm still catching up on a lot of things. I lived on the other side of the river for most of my life, but she was also a graphic designer for Jordan Marsh in Boston, and then later became the head graphic designer manager for Bradley's department stores. She was an illustrator, a graphic designer, did advertising layout, and she also was a scrimshander and an art instructor. So here's a lady who, she is still alive. I wrote an article on her. They moved out of their house on Green Street, and right next door there was somebody really well known right next door to them. And here's this great little anomaly that just seemed like nobody noticed she was Black, which is great.
Right.
It's quite a testament. her character and to the people around her, and there's so many stories like that. And that's one reason for the artist index, is to try to document everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So,
we'll start winding down this a little bit. And if you and it's not a commitment, but if you could give us a little bit of a snapshot of, based on the conversation we've just had, based on the conversation, the research that you've had, looking into Eldred, are there any other artists that you'd like to podcast on? I mean, I'm assuming William
there
Bradford.
is. Yeah. But
I mean, I can
was
walk
kinda
down the
looking
street to Church Street, and there's the monument to him that, I sent
Right,
it to a
yeah.
friend of mine in Detroit, and he's like, "Oh my God, really?" I'm like, "Yeah."
Yeah. No, I think William Bradford would be easy to do because there
Yeah.
seems to be a lot on it. But it's
Yeah.
like, it says there are people that I'm still looking into that I if I can find enough, because I want to talk about them. Like I want to learn about them and then share what I learned, because we don't know a lot about them. But yeah, there's I don't have my list with me, but yeah, there are others. I mean, there
Even obscure. I mean, even if we can get a conversation started on what was the name of that the woman artist? Dexter?
Lillian Dexter. Yeah. And maybe someone listening at some point, but like, I know all about her.
Exactly. That's my
Contact
auntie.
Yeah.
There's a woman that I ran across by accident over the weekend. A friend of ours had just sold their house, and they had some items in that they wanted to get rid of, and it is Vivian Lewis. That was her married name, Vivian Lewis.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you look up Two Women, One Shared Passion on the Prime Times magazine, that's that free magazine published by by Coastal Publications. It's the April 22 edition. And she's also a Swain School of Design graduate. But this other woman's name was Theodosia Chase. She was a photographer and a painter.
Okay. And she was a Fairhaven or local.
She may have been, yeah, but she was local. And then, there's a fine line, because as you know, the cities were the town and city were like Siamese twins, and then there was no, I think often there's too much emphasis placed on borders. Like that's a Fairhaven person, that's a New Bedford person, that's of course I'm from the outside. I grew up in Ohio, but I think I've now at the point that I think I've lived here about the same amount of time in Ohio and Massachusetts. So I'm I know the feeling. I mean, my first 7 years were in New York City, and then coming back here, and what makes for an interesting adult made for a miserable childhood in a lot of ways.
Yep. Oh, I've got stories.
Yeah. People still think, like, you have no accent.
Right.
But,
well, when I first moved here, I was told that I sounded like I was from the South. I was like, South? I had more of a drawl, like Ohio was a little twangy. And I may have lost that, but
I can see that. I had a friend of mine who was from Sandusky.
Okay.
His uncle Cheek, that I don't know what the man's full name, but it must have been Maxwell, because his uncle Cheek owned the Maxwell House, which Teddy Roosevelt made famous when he drank the coffee while he was staying there and said, "My God, this is good to the last drop."
I was just going to say
Maxwell House coffee.
Good to the last drop.
But Peter did have a little bit of that, more of a drawl than a twang. It's hard to describe.
Yeah, well, Sandusky's up by Cleveland, so I sometimes hear a similarity with like a Canadian accent when you get further up north, and like Ohio definitely varies. I mean,
that's Maine,
with those accents,
Don't you know that's what, Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Those. But again, having a wife from Detroit, it's, oh my God. Although in Detroit proper, I'm trying to read the supposedly French street signs, and they're laughing at me.
Yeah.
That's Gracio. No, that's Gratchet.
Right. Yep. Yep.
Okay, I give up.
It's literal.
Who else? Who else?
Oh gosh, I just have Eldred on the brain right now. I can't. I have a list here. Well, there's Charles Henry Gifford. There was
Ooh, good one. Yeah.
R. Swain Gifford.
Oh, another good one.
Clement
That's
Nye
3,
Swift.
4 with
Clement Nye, yeah. I mean,
all
I
right,
do
you got
have a
5.
list. Oh yeah, yeah. And I may have more, but
yeah. I'll just look over the grant papers again and make sure I'm not abusing you. But let's wrap this up then, because I mean, this has been wonderful.
Yeah. So there's just one. So when you asked me this, there was something else that that stuck out about Eldred, and he, because he didn't travel. He ended up traveling. Like in 1880, he went to Paris and studied at the Julian Academy, which they started allowing women to study there in the 1880s. And he went to the Mediterranean, where it just in the Middle East, where it it changed his art. He went from doing these, it didn't change completely, but he started doing like caravans and desert scenes and things like that. And later in life, he would move back to the area and just go up and down Maine and Massachusetts and got back to the.
I mean, Ryder as well. It seemed like they all did this weird grand tour. I mean, Venice was like on the top of Whistler. Everybody and his mother went to Venice.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I don't know if they've ever had a retrospective of the 20th century. The opening years of the 20th century of every artist who ever painted Venice.
Yeah.
It would be a huge show, right?
It would be. But he and I think he observed a lot and learned a lot about people, because he relates this story where he visited the Caribbean, and he was noting the lives of the poor blacks that lived there. And he picked up, there was a superstition there. There was this man who was in awful shape. He was missing a limb. He was poorly bandaged. He was hardly clothed. And he asked, what happened? What's going on? And there was a word, I forget what the word is. He's like, well, it's this. He's like, well, what is that? And it was like a superstition used to explain when bad things would happen to you because you did something. It was like bad karma. And so he wanted to know more. So he was asking around, and one person told him, he said, you can never understand because you're not a black man. And so the more he was down there and he observed this, he just, talking to different people, he came to understand the superstition it wasn't because of ignorance. It was this was something that was handed down to them. It was brought over when they were enslaved and came over and passed down. And he was like, this is part of their culture and who they are. It's not because they're dumb or they've been misled. That's how it is. And he accepted, people for who they are and what they believed.
It's a belief system.
A belief system, exactly. And I thought, well, that's pretty damn good for a kid that came from a small town and grew up poor and ended up seeing the world and learned about people and accepted people.
There's just so much on this man that you're opening up my head to. And for the longest time, I think he's always been, and it's only my estimation, that he's always been sort of in the background because you had all these other guys,
right?
Swain, Gifford, Bradford. They were always like the upper echelon, and he was always the guy who did Prince, because that was what I thought he did primarily. Because if I saw anything in houses, and my dad ran a janitorial contracting business, so I've been in a lot of houses and a lot of houses with art, and I swear to you, 8 out of every 10 houses had an Eldred or an Eldred hanging up somewhere.
Right. And that may have been that's kind of smart too, because, he had to pay the bills and it's like, well, if I can just, the painting sold, but, this works, but I can do etches and sell the prints. maybe it was a steady stream of
Yeah,
income.
if I can
for
sell
him.
10 prints, that
Right.
more than makes up for the sale of one painting,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he may have, I didn't see anything that referred to him as a print artist, or he was either sketching or landscapes or oil paintings. And,
Yeah. All right. Well, that's great. Any final words of wisdom before we close this podcast and look forward to the next one?
Right. No wisdom. No, I don't have wisdom. But no, I look forward to it. Yeah, I want to. Want to do more. This is great.
Great. And with that in mind, well, thanks, folks, for joining us on another podcast episode brought to you by the Artist Index website project. And today's guest, if you haven't caught on yet, is Kyle DeCiccio-Carey. And he is the director of the Millicent Library in Fairhaven, which is like working in a museum itself. It's the
oh my god, yeah, the collections here are, we have paintings, we have objects, we have an amazing archives collection. I'm working on kind of getting things in better order. I want to have more descriptions, things cataloged. I have so many digitization ideas running through my head. For one, the Eldred sketchbook, we have the stuff that needs to be shared. People need to be able to see this. And it's not something you can just show up and see. Things are in vault, or they're in storage, and things like that. But I'm going to change that. I need time.
Right. Yeah, it's like the town's attic. Just like the Smithsonian's the nation's attic. And
Right.
the more you can get this work out there into the forefront to other researchers, that would be phenomenal. So thank you so much for being our guest
Thank you for having me.
helping us with our